Some relationships are confusing in a very specific way, not because there is constant fighting, not because the other person treats you badly. In fact, if someone asked you how the relationship was going, you'd probably struggle to explain what was wrong. They text you, they make time for you, they remember your birthday, they ask if you got home safely. Some days, they're affectionate, present, completely engaged. Then, without any obvious reason, something changes. They're still there, but somehow they're harder to reach, harder to read, harder to feel close to. You tell yourself they're probably just busy or stressed. Maybe they're dealing with something they haven't talked about yet. So you give them space. Then they're warm again, for a while, until the same distance quietly returns. And after enough time, you stop asking yourself, do they actually like me? Because deep down, you think they probably do. Instead, you start asking a much more confusing question. Why do I feel so alone with someone who says they care about me? I've been thinking about that question for a long time, and I don't think emotional availability is what most people imagine. We've been taught to picture someone who's cold, detached, completely uninterested in a relationship. But that's rarely the person people struggle to let go of. The hardest relationships to understand are usually with someone who genuinely cares about you, just not in a way that allows you to feel emotionally safe. That's why these relationships can last far longer than they should. Not because there aren't warning signs, because the warning signs rarely look dramatic. They don't arrive all at once. They show up quietly, in ordinary conversations, in the moments when you need emotional closeness the most. And because each moment seems small on its own, it's easy to explain them away. Until one day, you realize you've spent months trying to understand someone instead of simply feeling understood by them. Looking back, I think that's one of the clearest differences between emotional availability and emotional unavailability. One leaves you feeling increasingly secure. The other leaves you constantly trying to figure out where you stand. And I think that's the first sign. Number one, you never really know where you stand. I don't think confusion gets talked about enough. We usually think unhealthy relationships are obvious, constant arguments, broken trust, harsh words, but confusion can be just as exhausting, sometimes even more. Because when someone clearly hurts you, at least you know where you stand. Confusion is different. It keeps hope alive. One week he seems completely present. He's texting first, making plans, laughing more, talking about places the two of you should visit together. You leave those conversations thinking, maybe we're finally getting somewhere. Then something shifts. Not dramatically. He doesn't disappear. He doesn't end the relationship. He simply becomes different. The messages become shorter. The conversations lose their warmth. You can feel the distance, even if you can't explain it. Naturally, your mind starts looking for answers. You replay your last conversation. You wonder if you said too much or not enough. You remember a joke that didn't quite land, a message he never replied to, a tiny moment that probably meant nothing, yet suddenly feels important. What's difficult is that every now and then he becomes warm again, just enough to make you believe everything is okay. And because of that, the confusion never really ends. I've noticed something about emotionally available people. Even when life becomes busy, even when work gets stressful, you usually know where you stand. You may not hear from them every hour, you may not see them every weekend, but their feelings don't feel like a mystery you have to solve. There's a quiet consistency about them. Not perfection, consistency. Emotionally unavailable men often struggle with that consistency, not because they're pretending, because emotional closeness itself feels unpredictable to them. Some days it feels comforting. Other days, without fully understanding why, it feels overwhelming. So they move closer, then further away, then closer again. Not always intentionally, but the effect on you is the same. You stop experiencing the relationship and you start analyzing it. Instead of asking, "How was your day?" you're asking yourself, "What did he mean by that?" Instead of enjoying the time you spend together, you're quietly measuring whether he seems different from last week. That's one of the first things emotional unavailability changes. It replaces certainty with constant interpretation. The hardest part is, people often mistake this emotional inconsistency for chemistry. They tell themselves, "I've never thought about someone this much before." But sometimes you're not thinking about him because the connection is deep. You're thinking about him because your mind is trying to solve something that never feels settled. Relationships aren't supposed to feel like puzzles. They're supposed to become easier to understand over time, not harder. And if you're constantly wondering where you stand, there's usually a reason. Because people who are emotionally available don't just let you into their schedule. Eventually, they let you into their inner world. Which brings us to the second sign, one that's surprisingly easy to miss, because on the surface it looks like he's opening up, until you realize he's told you everything about his day without telling you much about himself at all.
Number 2. He shares his life but rarely shares himself. At first, this one is incredibly easy to miss, mostly because it feels like the relationship is moving forward. You know where he works, you know his favorite restaurant, the football team he's supported since he was a kid, the music he listens to when he's driving, the stories about his friends, his plans for the weekend. You know what he did today, what annoyed him at work, what he wants to buy next month. If someone asked you, "Do you know him?" you'd probably say yes. But every now and then, a strange thought appears. You know a lot about his life, yet somehow you don't feel like you know him. There's a difference, and it's an important one. I've noticed that emotionally available people don't just tell you what happened. Eventually, they tell you what it meant to them. A bad day at work becomes, "I keep feeling like I'm letting everyone down." A disagreement with a friend becomes, "I hate conflict because I always think people will leave." A promotion becomes, "I'm happy, but I'm terrified I won't be good enough." That's emotional openness. Not simply sharing information, but allowing someone into the thoughts and feelings behind it. Emotionally unavailable men often stop one step before that. They'll happily tell you the story, but the emotion behind the story stays locked away. It's like watching a film with the sound turned off. You can see everything that's happening, but you never quite understand what the character is feeling. At first, you tell yourself, maybe that's just his personality. And maybe part of it is. Not everyone expresses emotions the same way. Some people are naturally quieter, more private, more reflective. There's nothing wrong with that. The difference is, even quiet people eventually let you into their emotional world. Emotionally unavailable people often don't. Weeks become months, months become years, and somehow you're still guessing how they actually feel. One thing I've realized is this. People don't become emotionally close because they exchange information. They become emotionally close because they exchange vulnerability. Not all at once, not dramatically, just little by little, one honest conversation at a time. That's how trust grows. But if one person keeps their emotional world hidden, the relationship can only become so deep. You can learn someone's routine, their habits, their preferences, even their history, and still feel like you're standing outside a locked door. Not because they don't care about you, because opening that door feels unsafe to them. The difficult part is, people often mistake this for mystery. They think maybe he just takes longer to open up. Sometimes that's true. But if every meaningful conversation stays at the surface, it may not be slowness, it may be avoidance. Because there's a difference between taking your time and never arriving. Which leads to something I've noticed over and over again. Eventually, every relationship reaches a point where one conversation matters more than all the others. The first truly difficult one. And that's often where emotional unavailability becomes impossible to ignore. Number 3. Every serious conversation ends before it really begins. Every healthy relationship has difficult conversations. There's no way around that. Two different people with different experiences, different fears, and different expectations are eventually going to misunderstand each other. That's normal. The conversation itself isn't the problem. It's what happens when the conversation begins. I've seen couples who could disagree for an hour and somehow end up feeling closer afterward. Not because they enjoyed arguing, because both people stayed emotionally present. Then I've seen the opposite, where the moment things become uncomfortable, the conversation quietly starts disappearing. You bring up something that's bothering you. He laughs it off. You're overthinking it. Or, can we not do this tonight? Sometimes he changes the subject completely. Sometimes he becomes unusually quiet. Sometimes he suddenly has somewhere else to be. And sometimes he agrees with everything you say just so the conversation can end. At first, it feels like you're avoiding one uncomfortable evening, but after a while, you realize you're avoiding the relationship itself. Because every important conversation gets postponed. Nothing is ever fully resolved. The same issues keep returning. Not because you're trying to start arguments, because nothing ever reached a conclusion. One thing I've learned is that emotional intimacy isn't built during easy conversations. It's built during difficult ones. Not because conflict creates closeness, because honesty does. When someone stays emotionally present, even while talking about something uncomfortable, you begin trusting that the relationship can survive hard moments. That's incredibly reassuring. Emotionally unavailable men often struggle with that, not because they don't care what you're feeling, but because uncomfortable emotions feel like something to escape rather than something to experience together. So instead of moving through the conversation, they move around it. The strange thing is, they're often trying to keep the peace. They think avoiding the discussion will protect the relationship, but silence has a way of creating distance, especially when one person keeps carrying conversations that never really happened. Eventually, you stop bringing things up altogether, not because everything is fine, because you've learned where the conversation always ends. Nowhere. And that's one of the saddest parts of emotional unavailability. It doesn't always create loud relationships. Sometimes it creates quiet ones, the kind where both people slowly stop saying what they're actually feeling, because one has stopped listening and the other has stopped believing there's any point in speaking. But even then, the relationship can continue, sometimes for a very long time, until one moment changes everything. The moment emotional closeness starts becoming real, because that's often when the next sign quietly appears.
Number 4, he pulls back when things start getting serious. This is probably the sign that confuses people the most, because it often comes after everything seemed to be going well. In the beginning, he's consistent. He initiates conversations, he seems excited to see you, he remembers the little things you tell him. You start thinking, this feels different. And maybe, for a while, it really does. The connection grows naturally. You spend more time together. You begin talking about the future without either of you forcing it. It feels like the relationship is finding its rhythm. Then, almost without warning, something shifts. Not overnight, not dramatically, just enough that you notice. He starts needing more space. He becomes harder to pin down. The conversations that used to last an hour now end after 10 minutes. He still replies. He still says he cares, but somehow you no longer feel the same closeness you felt a few weeks ago. That's the part people struggle to understand, because nothing obvious happened. There wasn't a huge argument, no betrayal, no clear reason for the distance. It almost feels as though the relationship crossed an invisible line, and suddenly he became uncomfortable. I've always found that interesting, because emotionally available people usually become more secure as trust grows. Emotionally unavailable people sometimes experience the opposite. The closer the relationship becomes, the more vulnerable it feels. And vulnerability can be frightening when you've spent years protecting yourself from it. So, instead of leaning into the connection, they instinctively create distance. Not because they've stopped caring, sometimes because they care more than they expected to. That sounds contradictory, but emotions often are. For someone who's uncomfortable with vulnerability, closeness doesn't always feel safe.
Sometimes it feels like losing control, like giving another person the power to hurt them. So, without fully realizing it, they take a step back. The difficult part is what happens to the other person. You begin working harder. You send the first message more often. You suggest seeing each other. You try to recreate whatever existed a month ago. The more distant he becomes, the more effort you put in. And before long, the relationship quietly becomes one person reaching while the other keeps retreating. That's an exhausting place to live, because you're no longer building a relationship together. You're trying to hold on to one by yourself. Healthy relationships don't usually require you to constantly earn the closeness you already had. They move forward, sometimes slowly, sometimes imperfectly, but they move. When every step toward emotional intimacy is followed by 2 steps backwards, it's worth asking why. Because emotional availability isn't measured by how someone behaves when everything is casual. It's measured by what happens when the relationship begins to matter. And that's where the next sign often reveals something even deeper. Because sometimes it's not that he refuses to care, it's that he doesn't know what to do with emotions, including his own. Number 5, he tries to fix feelings instead of sharing them. There's nothing wrong with wanting to solve problems. In fact, it's one of the ways many people show they care. You tell someone you've had a difficult day. They immediately start thinking, how can I help? That's not emotional unavailability. That's kindness. The difference is what happens when solving the problem becomes a way of avoiding the emotion itself. Imagine telling him, I've been feeling really overwhelmed lately. Before you've even finished explaining, he says, maybe you should just quit your job, or don't worry about it, it'll be fine, or perhaps you're thinking about it too much. On the surface, those responses sound supportive. He's trying to make things better. But somehow, you leave the conversation feeling exactly the same. Not because he ignored your problem, because he never really joined you in the feeling. Sometimes people don't need answers first. They need understanding. They need someone to sit beside them emotionally before trying to lead them somewhere else. Emotionally available people seem to understand that instinctively. They'll often ask, what was the hardest part? Or, that must have been really difficult. They don't rush to remove the feeling. They acknowledge it first. That small difference changes everything. Because when someone feels understood, they naturally become more open. Emotionally unavailable men find that much harder. Not because they don't care, but because emotions make them uncomfortable. Their own, and sometimes yours too. If they've spent years believing difficult emotions should be hidden, ignored, or solved as quickly as possible, then staying present with sadness, fear, or disappointment can feel almost impossible. So they reach for solutions, not realizing that what you're asking for isn't a solution, it's connection. I've noticed something about the strongest relationships. The people in them don't always know the right thing to say. They don't always have the perfect advice. Sometimes they simply stay. They listen. They ask another question. They let the silence exist without trying to rush past it. And somehow, that becomes more comforting than any solution could have been. Because emotional intimacy isn't built by fixing every feeling. It's built by sharing them. The irony is many emotionally unavailable men genuinely believe they're helping. They walk away thinking, I solved the problem, while the other person walks away thinking, he still doesn't understand how I feel. Neither person intended to create distance, yet distance appears anyway. And after enough conversations like that, something quietly begins to change. Not the relationship on the outside, the relationship on the inside. You can still spend time together, still laugh, still go on dates. Everything can look perfectly normal. Yet somehow, you begin carrying a feeling that's much harder to explain. A kind of loneliness that exists even when you're sitting right beside the person you love. And I think that's the hardest sign of all.
Number 6, you feel lonely even when you're together.
I've saved this one until the end because I don't think it's usually the first sign people notice. It's the one they understand later, often much later, because loneliness isn't always about being alone. Sometimes it's about feeling emotionally alone while someone is sitting right beside you. That's a much harder feeling to explain. I've heard people describe relationships like this before. They'll say, "Nothing is really wrong. We still spend time together. We still laugh. He still tells me he loves me." Then they'll pause and add something they can't quite put into words. "I just don't feel close to him anymore." I think that pause says more than anything else, because emotional loneliness rarely arrives overnight. It builds quietly, conversation by conversation, moment by moment. You stop bringing up certain topics because they never seem to go anywhere. You stop talking about your fears because they always end with advice instead of understanding. You stop asking what he's feeling because the answer is almost always, "I'm fine." Without realizing it, you slowly stop inviting each other into their inner worlds. The relationship keeps moving, but the emotional connection quietly stops growing. From the outside, everything still looks normal. You still go out together, still celebrate birthdays, still take pictures, still make plans. People might even describe the two of you as a happy couple. But relationships aren't measured by what they look like. They're measured by what they feel like. And one of the loneliest feelings in the world is looking across the room at someone you love and realizing you no longer know how to reach them emotionally. The difficult part is that many people blame themselves. They think, maybe I'm expecting too much. Maybe this is just what relationships become after a while. I don't think that's true. Every relationship changes. The excitement settles, life becomes busier, the conversations become less dramatic. That's normal. But emotional closeness shouldn't slowly disappear simply because time has passed. If anything, healthy relationships usually become more emotionally safer over time. Not because people become perfect, because they become known. They've learned how to comfort each other, how to disagree without creating distance, how to sit with difficult emotions instead of avoiding them. That's what emotional intimacy grows into. When that growth never happens, loneliness often takes its place. And that's why emotional unavailability can be so difficult to recognize. It doesn't always look like rejection. Sometimes it looks like almost enough conversations, almost enough affection, almost enough vulnerability, almost enough connection. But relationships can't survive on almost. Eventually, someone begins missing a kind of closeness they've never actually experienced. Looking back, I don't think emotional availability is about being the most expressive person in the room. It's not about saying the perfect words or sharing every thought you have. It's something much quieter than that. It's the willingness to let another person genuinely know you and the courage to know them in return. That's what creates emotional safety. That's what turns two people spending time together into two people sharing a life. Which brings me back to something I said at the beginning. The hardest emotionally unavailable relationships aren't usually with someone who doesn't care. They're often with someone who cares, but doesn't know how to let another person fully into their emotional world. And that's what makes them so confusing. Because caring and connecting aren't the same thing. You can genuinely love someone and still struggle to be emotionally available. You can have good intentions and still leave the other person feeling unseen. Recognizing that isn't about blaming anyone. It's about understanding what healthy connection actually looks like. So let's look back at the 6 signs. You never really know where you stand. He shares his life, but rarely shares himself. Every serious conversation ends before it really begins. He pulls back when things start getting serious. He tries to fix feelings instead of sharing them. And over time, you begin feeling lonely, even when you're together. No single sign proves someone is emotionally unavailable. Everyone has difficult seasons. Everyone gets stressed. Everyone struggles to express themselves sometimes. The difference is the pattern. If these moments become the relationship instead of occasional exceptions, it's worth paying attention. Because love isn't just about caring for someone. It's about creating a relationship where both people feel emotionally safe enough to be fully known. And that's something neither person should have to carry alone. So I'm curious, which of these signs do you think people overlook the most? I'd really like to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if this conversation helped put words to something you've been feeling, I hope you'll join me again in the next one.